The secret trust my family didn't know about until I reclaimed the estate. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. My uncle laughed when he threw me out of my own home, but he wasn't laughing when I returned with the deed and the sheriff. The heavy oak doors of Blackwood Manor groaned as I pushed them open, the familiar scent of beeswax and old paper hitting me like a physical blow. It had been 5 long years since I last stood in this grand foyer. Beside me, Officer Miller adjusted his utility belt, the metallic clinking echoing against the marble floors. I looked up at the sweeping staircase, remembering the days I used to slide down the banister, much to my grandfather's amusement. My grandfather built this legacy with dirt under his fingernails. To him, Blackwood wasn't just a monument to wealth. It was a testament to survival, a sanctuary for a family that had started with absolutely nothing. "Can I help you?" A sharp voice snapped from the landing. It was Beatrice, my cousin, wearing a silk robe and holding a half-empty mimosa glass. She froze when she saw the uniform. Then, Uncle Sterling appeared behind her. He still had that arrogant, puff-chest posture, wearing an expensive cashmere sweater he definitely bought with my grandfather's money. "Arthur," Sterling sneered, descending the stairs. "What is the meaning of this? Have you lost your mind, bringing a cop to my house?" "It's not your house, Sterling," I said quietly, the words tasting like sweet vindication. It never was. The entitlement radiating from him was palpable. For 5 years, he had treated Blackwood like his personal piggy bank, hosting lavish parties and bleeding the accounts dry while I scraped by. He stole the only place I ever felt completely safe. He stole the legacy grandfather meant to preserve. "You're trespassing, boy," Sterling growled, his face reddening as he reached the bottom step. "I'll have you arrested for this stunt." I didn't flinch. Instead, I pulled a thick, leather-bound folder from my satchel. The embossed gold lettering on the front seemed to catch the morning light. It was the culmination of months of secret investigations, countless hours in dusty law offices, and the unearthing of a truth Sterling thought he had buried with my grandfather. This was the moment I had dreamt of every single night since I was violently pushed out into the freezing November rain. I looked Sterling dead in the eyes, feeling the weight of the undeniable proof resting right in my hands. He stepped closer to grab the folder, completely unaware of the trap closing around him. The rain was relentless the day we buried grandfather. I stood by the grave long after the rest of the family had retreated to their luxury cars, ignoring the mud soaking into my only decent suit. Grandfather and I had spent thousands of hours together in his workshop at Blackwood Manor, restoring antique furniture. He taught me patience, craftsmanship, and the value of honest labor. Uncle Sterling, on the other hand, only visited when he needed a check to cover his latest failed business venture. When I finally returned to the manor that afternoon, shivering and heartbroken, I found the front doors locked. That was impossible. I had lived there for the last 7 years, caring for grandfather as his health declined while Sterling was off vacationing in Aspen. Confused, I walked around to the side entrance, only to find 3 heavy garbage bags sitting on the wet grass. My heart dropped. I ripped open the nearest bag. My clothes, my tools, my books. "Don't make a mess on my lawn, Arthur," a voice called out. Sterling stood on the covered porch, flanked by 2 burly locksmiths who were packing up their equipment. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice trembling with a mix of grief and sudden, blinding rage. "This is my home. Grandfather wanted me here." "Grandfather is dead," Sterling said coldly, lighting a cigar. "And as it turns out, he left the entire estate to his only surviving son, me. I'm the sole executor and sole beneficiary of the will. Your little free ride is officially over." "He would never do that," I yelled, stepping toward him. We were in the middle of restoring the West Wing. He promised I would take over the estate's preservation. Sterling pulled a crisp, folded document from his jacket pocket and waved it at me from a safe distance. "Signatures don't lie, Arthur. The will is ironclad, dated just last month. You have no legal right to step foot on this property ever again. If I see you here tomorrow, I will press charges." Beatrice leaned out of a second-story window, snapping a photo of me standing in the mud with her phone. "Bye, Artie," she taunted. I gathered my soaking bags, knowing deep down that Sterling had somehow manipulated the old man in his final, vulnerable days. I promised myself I would eventually find out what really happened behind those locked doors. The first year after the banishment was pure survival. With only a few $100s to my name and my tools, I rented a tiny, drafty apartment in the city and took whatever odd jobs I could find. I channeled my grief into the only thing that made sense, the work grandfather had taught me. Slowly, I built a reputation in architectural restoration. My small city workshop became my sanctuary, smelling of sawdust, linseed oil, and old brick. It wasn't the sweeping grandeur of Blackwood Manor, but it was honest, and it was mine. 5 years passed. I had convinced myself that I had moved on. I stopped checking the social media profiles where Beatrice shamelessly flaunted her old money aesthetic, posing in front of the fireplaces I had painstakingly retiled by hand. I accepted that the estate was legally gone, even if the memories of grandfather still echoed in my mind every time I picked up a chisel. I was grounded, patient, and completely detached from Sterling's toxic world. Or so I thought. It was a Tuesday evening in late October. I was closing up the workshop, wiping down my workbench, when the mail carrier knocked on the frosted glass of the front door. He handed me a thick, heavy manila envelope. There was no return address, just my name and the workshop's location typed in an old-fashioned serif font that looked like it had been punched by a manual typewriter. I grabbed a box cutter and carefully sliced the top open. Inside was a smaller, wax-sealed envelope and a single brass key. My breath hitched in my throat. I recognized that key instantly. It belonged to the antique mahogany desk in grandfather's private library, a desk he had specifically told me never to open unless he was in the room. My hand started to shake as I broke the dark red wax seal on the enclosed letter. The paper was thick, expensive parchment. I unfolded it, expecting to see some sort of cruel prank from Beatrice or another legal threat from Uncle Sterling telling me to stay away. Instead, the handwriting was sharp, elegant, and entirely unfamiliar, yet the message it contained carried the weight of a ghost. The letter demanded my immediate presence regarding an urgent matter of my grandfather's true legacy. The signature at the bottom of the letter made my stomach do a flip. Elias Vance. Mr. Vance was the fiercely loyal family attorney who had handled my grandfather's business affairs for 4 decades. Shortly before grandfather died, rumors circulated that Vance had gone entirely senile and retired to a care facility, which was why Sterling had supposedly brought in his own flashy lawyers to handle the estate. The next morning, I drove to the address provided, a dusty, wood-paneled law office tucked away in a forgotten corner of the city's historic district. A bell chimed as I walked in. Sitting behind a massive oak desk was Mr. Vance. He looked older, his hair completely white, but his eyes were as sharp and piercing as ever. He wasn't senile, not even close. "Arthur," he said, his voice a dry rasp that commanded absolute respect. "You have your grandfather's hands. Calloused. Good." "Mr. Vance, I don't understand," I said, placing the letter and the brass key on his desk. "Sterling said you were unwell. He said you relinquished all your duties before grandfather passed." Vance let out a bitter, humorless laugh. "Sterling is a liar and a thief, Arthur. I stepped away because your grandfather and I orchestrated it that way. We needed Sterling to believe he had won. We needed him to drop his guard." I sat down heavily in the leather chair opposite him, my mind racing. Won what? He took everything. He showed me a will, Mr. Vance. He had signatures. He took Blackwood. He took a decoy. Vance replied smoothly, leaning forward and steepling his fingers. "Your grandfather loved you, Arthur. You were the only one who cared about the history, the preservation, the legacy of that home. He knew exactly what his son was, a greedy, lavish fool who viewed Blackwood as a personal ATM. If your grandfather had simply left the estate to you in a standard will, Sterling would have tied you up in probate court for a decade, bleeding the assets dry to pay for his litigation." Vance stood up and walked over to a heavy steel safe in the corner of the room. He began spinning the combination dial with practiced precision. "So, we created an alternative solution to bypass the greedy family members entirely," Vance murmured. He pulled out a massive, black binder and placed it right in front of me. I stared at the black binder as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. Mr. Vance opened it, revealing hundreds of pages of dense legal documents, all bearing my grandfather's unmistakable, sprawling signature. The dates on the documents were from nearly a year before he died. long before the supposed final will that Sterling had waved in my face on the lawn. "What is this?" I asked, lightly tracing the ink on the top page. "This, Arthur, is the Blackwood Heritage Trust," Vance explained, his tone shifting into professional precision. "Before his health began to severely decline, your grandfather secretly transferred the deed to the estate, all associated land, and the bulk of his liquid wealth into this irrevocable trust. It is completely insulated from probate." "But Sterling's will?" I trailed off, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what I was hearing. "The will Sterling forced your grandfather to sign under duress only governed assets that your grandfather personally owned at the time of his death," Vance said with a sly smile. "But he didn't own Blackwood Manor anymore. The trust did. And the trust is a private entity that was specifically instructed to remain dormant and entirely hidden for exactly 5 years." "Why 5 years?" I asked, my heart pounding against my ribs. "To let the statute of limitations expire on Sterling's ability to easily contest the transfers, and to let him hang himself with his own financial mismanagement," Vance replied coldly. "Your grandfather knew Sterling would squander whatever money he thought he had. He wanted him exposed, broken, and legally powerless before you took it back." Vance flipped to the final page and pointed to a specific clause highlighted in yellow. I read the words, and a lump formed in my throat. It named me, Arthur, as the sole, undisputed beneficiary and the controlling trustee of the Blackwood Heritage Trust. "As of midnight last night, the 5-year waiting period is officially over," Vance said, his eyes locking onto mine. "You are the true legal owner of the estate. Sterling has been unknowingly trespassing for 5 years." I realized I had the power to take everything back from the man who destroyed me. Before we could legally strike and activate the asset freeze, Mr. Vance insisted we needed current photographic evidence of the estate's condition to prove Sterling was committing waste against the property. I hadn't been near Blackwood Manor since the day of the funeral, and the drive up the winding coastal road filled me with a sickening mix of anxiety and profound anticipation. I parked my truck a half-mile down the road and hiked through the dense pine forest that bordered the rear of the property. When I finally breached the tree line and looked down at my childhood home, my stomach instantly churned with disgust. The majestic slate roof was missing shingles, the copper gutters were sagging, and the historic rose gardens grandfather loved so dearly were completely overgrown with noxious weeds. But the real horror was what Beatrice had done to the south wing patio. She had ripped out the 19th-century stonework to install a cheap, garish infinity pool with neon pink LED lighting, clearly designed solely as a backdrop for her social media posts. I crept closer, hiding behind a row of untrimmed hedges, and snapped photos with my camera. Through the towering floor-to-ceiling windows of the conservatory, I saw Uncle Sterling pacing angrily while yelling into his cell phone. The antique Persian rugs had been replaced with tacky, faux marble tile. "I don't care about the interest rate, just approve the extension." Sterling's voice drifted through an open window, vibrating with desperate panic. "I have equity in the house. Use the house." I kept my camera rolling. He was bleeding the property dry. The pristine estate my grandfather had spent his entire life preserving was rotting from the inside out, sacrificed on the altar of Sterling's massive ego and Beatrice's endless vanity. I documented the cracked foundations, the peeling paint on the window trim, and the overall neglect that screamed of a man who was utterly broke but desperately pretending to be rich. Seeing the desecration of grandfather's legacy erased any lingering doubts or mercy I had in my heart. I returned to Vance with the evidence, ready to burn Sterling's fake empire to the ground. Back in Mr. Vance's wood-paneled office, we spread the photographs across his desk alongside the preliminary financial reports his private investigator had discreetly gathered. The visual decay of Blackwood Manor was tragic, but the paper trail we uncovered was downright criminal. "Sterling hasn't just neglected the property," Vance said, adjusting his reading glasses as he scrutinized a stack of banking documents. "He's been actively cannibalizing it. Look at this." He slid a heavily redacted bank statement toward me. I scanned the highlighted rows, my jaw clenching as the reality of the numbers set in. Sterling had taken out not one, but 3 massive secondary mortgages against the estate over the last 4 years. "How is that even possible?" I asked, baffled. "If the trust secretly owned the property, How did the bank approve a loan using the estate as collateral? Because the trust was unrecorded, hiding in the shadows, Vance explained grimly. Sterling presented the fake will and the old deed to a remarkably negligent loan officer. But here is the truly shocking part, Arthur. To get the third loan last year, Sterling needed a co-signer because his personal credit was completely destroyed. Look at the signature. He handed me the loan origination document. Right there, on the bottom line, was my grandfather's signature. He forged it. I whispered, feeling a cold wave of absolute fury wash over me. Grandfather had been dead for 4 years when this was signed. Exactly, Vance said softly. Sterling was so desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle. The country club memberships, Beatrice's luxury cars, the endless parties, that he committed blatant mortgage fraud. He assumed that because he owned the estate, no one would ever look closely enough to challenge the paperwork. He has been pulling out cash advances to pay off the previous loans. It's a massive, crumbling Ponzi scheme. The sheer disrespect to my grandfather's memory was staggering. Sterling had literally sold off the equity of our family's history to fund a shallow, pathetic illusion. We needed one final piece of physical evidence to completely destroy him in civil court. To prove the forgery definitively, Vance needed the original, handwritten estate ledger my grandfather kept in his private study. It contained his authentic daily signatures and ink samples, which a forensic expert could use to absolutely crush Sterling's fake mortgage documents. The problem was, the ledger was locked inside the antique mahogany desk, the desk I now held the brass key for. I couldn't just knock on the front door. So, I waited for Friday night. Beatrice was hosting another one of her notorious, loud masquerade parties, treating the historic manor like a cheap nightclub. The booming bass of electronic music rattled the stained glass windows as I slipped through the neglected servant's entrance at the back of the kitchen. Wearing a dark jacket and a simple black domino mask I bought at a party store, I blended perfectly into the sea of intoxicated, wealthy 20-somethings roaming the halls. I kept my head down, dodging spilled champagne and avoiding eye contact as I navigated the familiar corridors toward the east wing. Grandfather's study was locked, but the old credit card trick I used as a teenager still worked perfectly on the latch. I slipped inside, closing the heavy oak door behind me, instantly cutting off the thumping music. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke. Sterling had clearly been using it. I rushed to the mahogany desk, my hands shaking as I pulled the brass key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a satisfying click. I pulled open the heavy bottom drawer and grabbed the leather-bound ledger. Suddenly, the doorknob rattled violently. I swear to God, the good cigars are in here. Sterling's slurred voice boomed from the hallway, followed by the sound of a key aggressively scraping against the lock. Panic flooded my veins. I shoved the ledger into my jacket, frantically scanning the shadowy room for an escape route. There was nowhere to hide, and the heavy door was already swinging inward. I pressed myself flat behind the velvet curtains just as the room flooded with blinding light. The very next morning, Mr. Vance and I went to the imposing Stone County Courthouse. We sat in a sterile, fluorescent-lit room for hours, waiting for the clerk to review the immense stack of documents. With the ledger confirming the forgery beyond a shadow of a doubt and the trust documents strictly verified by the presiding judge, we quietly filed the official paperwork to formally transfer the title of Blackwood Manor back to its rightful owner. The legal trap was now meticulously set, and it was entirely invisible to the naked eye. "It is done, Arthur," Vance said, handing me the freshly stamped, incredibly heavy stack of documents. "The Blackwood Heritage Trust is now officially recorded and active with the state. Furthermore, because of the overwhelming evidence of severe mortgage fraud we submitted, the judge has quietly granted our emergency motion for an injunction." "What exactly does that mean for Sterling today?" I asked, feeling a strange mix of adrenaline and profound, grounding calm. "It means an absolute, immediate asset freeze," Vance replied with a predatory, highly satisfied smile. "Every single bank account tied to the estate, every line of credit secured by the property, and every penny he thinks he has access to is officially locked down by the federal authorities pending a full criminal investigation. He just doesn't know it yet." We had systematically dismantled his entire fraudulent empire without saying a single word to him. The financial guillotine had already dropped, Sterling simply hadn't felt the cold steel hit his neck yet. I looked down at the deed, seeing my name where it truly belonged. I waited for the beautiful moment when his fake empire would officially begin to crumble. The fallout began exactly 3 days later, and it was absolutely glorious to observe from the shadows. I had hired a discreet private investigator to monitor the estate and provide me with daily updates, wanting to savor every single second of the trap springing shut. The first domino fell on a Tuesday morning at the most exclusive country club in the county. Sterling tried to pay for a lavish, champagne-fueled breakfast with his primary platinum card, only to have it immediately declined. The investigator watched from a nearby table as Sterling loudly berated the poor waiter, completely convinced it was a stupid, embarrassing banking error. He smugly tried a second premium card. Declined. Then a third. Declined. He stormed out of the dining room, his face flushed with rage and embarrassment, furiously dialing his wealth manager. But his wealth manager couldn't help him because the accounts didn't legally belong to Sterling anymore. The federal freeze was absolute and impenetrable. Later that afternoon, the situation escalated beautifully. Beatrice had just pulled her pristine, white luxury SUV out of the estate's wrought iron gates when a heavy-duty tow truck suddenly blocked her path. 2 men stepped out with strict repossession orders. "You can't do this," Beatrice shrieked, her shrill voice echoing down the quiet street as she stomped her designer heels on the pavement. "Do you know who my father is? He'll sue you into the ground. This is a simple clerical error." "Take it up with the bank, lady," the driver muttered indifferently, hooking the steel winch to her precious status symbol. Sterling came running down the long driveway, waving his cell phone and yelling empty threats about calling his high-priced lawyers. He looked incredibly disheveled, his usual arrogant posture replaced by frantic, sweaty desperation. He was desperately trying to juggle a dozen falling knives, completely unaware that I was the one who had pushed them off the counter. The stolen funds that kept their miserable, hollow lives afloat had vanished overnight. They were entirely broke, terrified, and trapped in a house they no longer legally owned. With the financial freeze fully choking them, it was time to initiate the final phase of my grandfather's brilliant plan. Working through Mr. Vance's office, I established a blind legal entity named Heritage Preservation Holdings LLC. Through this company, we sent a formal, extremely intimidating certified letter directly to Blackwood Manor. The notice demanded an immediate, mandatory property inspection and asset verification to assess the estate's structural integrity against the severely defaulted mortgage lines. We scheduled the inspection for Friday morning at exactly 9 o'clock. My investigator reported that the arrival of the certified letter sent Sterling into an absolute tailspin. He spent Thursday evening frantically ordering the remaining household staff, the ones he hadn't already fired because he suddenly couldn't make payroll, to deep clean the grand foyer and hide any obvious signs of his destructive neglect. He was setting up a stage, preparing to do what he always did: lie, bribe, and bully his way out of accountability. I knew exactly how he planned to handle the situation. He would put on his finest tailored suit, pour a glass of expensive scotch, and try to intimidate the anonymous corporate inspector with his fabricated wealth and aggressive bravado. He thought he was dealing with some low-level bank clerk who could be easily manipulated with a discreet envelope of cash or empty threats of endless litigation. He had absolutely no idea that the holding company was just a temporary shield. He didn't know that the person walking through those heavy oak doors wouldn't be a random auditor, but the nephew he had violently discarded in the freezing rain 5 years ago. I spent Thursday night carefully ironing my best suit, packing the massive binder of trust documents into my leather satchel, and mentally preparing for the intense confrontation I had dreamed about for years. I was finally going back to Blackwood Manor to reclaim everything that was rightfully mine. That brings us back to the present moment, standing in the grand foyer with the morning sun casting long shadows across the marble floor. Officer Miller stood stoically to my right, while Mr. Vance, leaning heavily on his silver-tipped cane, stood to my left. The trap was sprung, and there was nowhere left for Sterling to run. "Arthur, I don't know what kind of sick joke you think this is, but you are completely out of your mind," Sterling hissed, his face morphing from shock to pure, venomous rage as he descended the final few stairs. Beatrice trailed behind him, nervously clutching her silk robe, her eyes darting between me and the police officer. "I'm here representing Heritage Preservation Holdings," I said evenly, keeping my voice dangerously calm. "We're here for the 9 o'clock property inspection." Sterling barked a harsh, desperate laugh. You're the inspector? Good God, you're more pathetic than I thought. You forged some fake credentials to sneak back into a house you have no right to be in? Officer, arrest this man for trespassing immediately. Officer Miller didn't move a single muscle. He simply crossed his arms and looked at Sterling with a mixture of pity and contempt. "I suggest you let the man speak, sir." Sterling's arrogant smirk faltered slightly. "What is this? Vance, I thought you were dead in some nursing home." "I'm very much alive, Sterling," Vance replied dryly. "And I highly recommend you sit down." I didn't wait for him to respond. I walked over to the massive, priceless antique mahogany table in the center of the foyer, the very table grandfather and I used to polish together. I unlatched my leather satchel and pulled out the thick, black binder. With a flick of my wrist, I slammed it down onto the polished wood. The heavy thud echoed loudly throughout the cavernous, silent room. "I'm not the inspector, Sterling," I said, stepping back from the table. "I'm the landlord." I watched his arrogant expression slowly shatter as he stared blindly at the embossed documents. Sterling stared at the thick binder as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the antique table. With trembling hands, he flipped open the heavy cover. He read the first page, his eyes darting back and forth across the dense legal text. He flipped to the second page, then the third. With every passing second, the remaining color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified ghost. This is a forgery," he stammered, his voice cracking violently. "This is impossible. I have the will. The house was left to me. I am the sole heir. You have a worthless piece of paper that governed assets your father didn't even own, Mr." Vance stated coldly, stepping forward and tapping the trust document with his cane. "The Blackwood Heritage Trust was established and funded a full year before he passed. He knew exactly what you were, Sterling. He knew you would bleed this legacy dry. Arthur is the sole trustee and legal owner. You have been squatting here illegally for 5 years." Beatrice let out a piercing, hysterical shriek. "Squatting? Dad, what is he talking about? Tell him to leave. Tell the police to arrest him. How much of my grandfather's blood did you sell to buy that car they repossessed yesterday, Beatrice?" I snapped, finally letting a fraction of my suppressed anger bleed through my calm facade. "How many illegal mortgages did you forge, Sterling, to pay for your country club memberships?" Sterling stumbled backward, hitting the banister. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide with wild panic. The illusion of his immense wealth, his absolute power, and his unearned status was disintegrating right in front of his eyes. He realized the bank freeze wasn't a clerical error. He realized he was utterly ruined. "You set me up," Sterling whispered, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You entirely destroyed my life." "No, Uncle Sterling," I replied softly. "You destroyed your own life when you betrayed your family." I turned to Officer Miller and nodded, signaling him to begin the final eviction phase. Officer Miller stepped forward, pulling a folded stack of official eviction notices from his uniform pocket and handing them directly to Sterling, who took them with entirely numb fingers. "Sterling and Beatrice Blackwood," Officer Miller announced, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "By order of the county court, you are hereby served with an immediate notice of eviction for illegal occupation and criminal trespass. You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal belongings and vacate these premises." 2 hours, Beatrice screamed, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. "I have entire closets of designer clothes. I have antique furniture. I can't pack my whole life in 2 hours." "You don't own any of the furniture, Beatrice," I said coldly. "And you will pack a single suitcase each. Everything else remains on site pending the forensic financial audit. If you attempt to remove anything that belongs to this estate, you will be arrested for theft on the spot." The next 2 hours were the most intensely satisfying moments of my entire life. I stood by the front doors like a silent sentinel, watching as my greedy relatives scrambled through the house they had desecrated. Sterling looked like a broken, hollow man, haphazardly throwing a few expensive suits into a duffel bag, his hands shaking so violently he could barely operate the zipper. Beatrice sobbed hysterically the entire time, mourning the loss of her unearned luxury. When the 2 hours were finally up, Officer Miller escorted them onto the front porch. They stood there in the chilling morning air, surrounded by nothing but the cheap luggage they could carry. There were no luxury cars waiting for them, no fawning servants, just the harsh, undeniable reality of their own devastating greed. "Goodbye, Sterling," I said, my hand resting firmly on the heavy brass doorknob of my home. I firmly pulled the heavy oak doors shut, finally locking them out in the cold forever. The aftermath of the eviction was swift and brutally absolute. With the mountain of evidence Mr. Vance and I provided, the federal authorities moved in aggressively. Sterling was formally indicted on multiple counts of severe mortgage fraud, grand larceny, and forgery. Without his stolen wealth to pay for high-powered defense attorneys, he eventually accepted a harsh plea deal and is currently serving significant time in a federal penitentiary. Beatrice, completely cut off from the endless money tap she had grown accustomed to, was forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment and actually get a minimum wage job. Her once boastful social media accounts have been entirely silent for months. As for me, I finally moved back into Blackwood Manor. The historic house was wounded, stripped of some of its dignity by their shallow greed, but its architectural bones were still incredibly strong. I immediately sold my small city workshop and moved my tools directly into grandfather's old restoration garage. The process of bringing the massive estate back to its former glory is going to take years. I spend my weekends carefully ripping out Beatrice's tacky renovations, replacing the cheap fixtures with authentic, period-accurate materials, and painstakingly restoring the overgrown rose gardens. It's exhausting, heavily physical work, but every time I sweep the dust from the original hardwood floors, I feel an overwhelming sense of profound peace. This entire grueling ordeal taught me that true legacy isn't about bank accounts or fleeting status symbols. True inheritance is the deep respect you have for the people who came before you, and the heavy responsibility you take for preserving their memory. Sterling tried to steal our family's soul, but he failed completely because he never understood its true, underlying value.